Hey guys, Arleesha here and welcome to another video. If you're like me and you've ever been curious about Arteza products, you may have noticed that they have a lot of different watercolor papers, and it can be kind of confusing to figure out which one you should purchase, which ones work well, and which one would be best for you. So when Arteza reached out to me recently asking if I wanted to try any more of their products, I pitched this idea to them of showing you guys as many of their watercolor papers as I could, as many different types, and they were very excited about the idea. So today we are going to be testing out these 5 different types of Arteza watercolor paper. One that I want to touch on a little bit before we get started is this one here that was new to me. It's a premium paper, which is on the student grade side, as opposed to their expert watercolor paper, which is of a higher quality, generally speaking. And this one is called a DIY watercolor frame. So it's all made of watercolor paper, but the paper is perforated and creased in such a way so that you can fold it up, and it folds into something that looks a lot like a canvas, which is really interesting. And I just wanted to take a minute to show you guys how this comes together, because when I saw this on their website, I thought that if it functions properly and works well, it could be the kind of thing that's like a really ingenious idea for how to display watercolor paintings in a different way. It folds up really nicely and it feels really sturdy, but of course that doesn't mean much if the paper isn't actually enjoyable to use, so we'll talk a little bit about that very soon. The 5 paper types here that I have are their sketchbook paper, the premium folding frame that we just saw, their expert paper, and the expert 100% cotton. So those are the 5 we're looking at before. And I want to show you some little sketches, paintings that I have been doing with these papers. So the first one that you saw was the sketchbook, then the premium folding paper, the expert, and the expert 100% cotton. So I have been painting on these various papers. Some of these I've been painting on for a long time now. So this first piece here was in the sketchbook, and you can see that as far as the paper texture, it looks like the paint dries a lot like how you would expect alcohol markers to dry. The premium paper has very distinct horizontal or vertical lines, depending on how you rotate the paper, that you can see no matter how many layers you put on, really, that texture is so pronounced, so it's something to keep in mind. The premium folding paper is this one here, and you can see there might be a little bit of that line texture, but not as much. It's broken up and looks a little bit more organic, and after being painted on and then folded, it actually didn't warp too much. The expert paper, this one was new to me as well. I had never tried it before, and it actually surprised me. Even though it does have a subtle cold press texture and is listed as cold press, I found working on it to feel a lot more like hot press, and we'll talk about that soon. The last paper is the Expert 100% Cotton, which I have been using a ton of. Spoiler, I love this paper. It functions exactly how I want a cold press paper to function. It just works really well, and I enjoy it very much. I love that texture when I'm looking for it. Now that we've talked a little bit about paper textures, let's go ahead and do some actual painting. I've sketched a similar shaped eye on all 5 of the different paper types and removed a piece from the sketchbook, so they're all the same size as well. And we're going to paint on each one and see how it goes. Let's start with the most inexpensive paper. I'll try to list the average price per sheet for each paper type as well. And the least expensive one is the sketchbook paper. This one has a nice gentle cold press texture and was very easy to sketch on. So I was really excited about it at first. And as soon as I started laying down my paint, I started having issues. So the paper, something to do with the sizing or the way it's processed, that paint just soaks right into the paper, and as soon as you lay it down, it's almost impossible to come back and move your paint, which is a technique that I absolutely have to have. So making little adjustments, blending out your color, it gets really difficult. And as soon as that paper started to get really wet, I could see the paper almost pilling, like the individual fibers of the paper weren't the same sizes and they were absorbing water differently. And to be completely honest, this paper was just not enjoyable to work on. I found that my layers just kind of blended together and didn't look very nice. The colors dried very dull. Overall, I can't say that I would recommend this one to almost anyone. As soon as I started working on the second paper, the premium paper, it was so much more relaxing and I felt so much freer to actually manipulate my paint. And it was almost like day and night, the difference, even though this one has a very pronounced texture, which overall I'm not a huge fan of. Over time, I've come to not like this texture as much. I have been using this paper for a while, and that's mostly because that texture is very apparent when you scan artwork. So for me, I like to turn my paintings into prints. And, you know, my printer paper that I use doesn't have that texture, but if I print these paintings, it does. And I don't want to have to go through the big hassle of digitally editing my paintings to try to remove that texture. It's not necessarily my favorite thing, but the paper itself, I think, is much closer to like when I rank watercolors and I say that there are watercolors that get in your way, ones that don't get in your way, and ones that shine on their own. I think we can categorize these papers into those same categories as well. So that sketchbook paper, the first one, that one's just going to get in your way. I think it would really make it learning difficult for a beginner. The second premium paper here, I feel like gets in your way so much less. It's not necessarily a strong standard watercolor paper, but you can learn about colors, you can learn about placement, you can even do a decent amount of layering. The colors dry relatively vibrant. There's not a lot of color shift as the paints dry, and while not my favorite, it's a pretty solid watercolor paper for learning and practice. I had no idea what to expect from this folding watercolor paper. It's listed as being of the same tier as the premium paper. This is also called premium, but it's not the same paper. It has a different texture. So it's not like they just took the premium paper and embossed it and added some perforations. This is definitely a different paper. Like I said before, I love the way this paper folds. I feel like it's really sturdy, and I decided to paint on this one folded. The example piece that you saw before was actually painted before having folded it, so I just painted on it, and then after the painting was completely dry, I folded the paper. If you're interested in seeing that process, it's actually a real-time video for YouTube members and patrons right now. So while I was working on this one, I found almost immediately that my layers were going on so much cleaner and so much more vibrantly. I could see each color layering on top of each other in a way that was so clean, and it's really interesting doing these back to back because when you work on just one at a time, you might not notice the tiny little differences between each type of paper, but getting to do these back to back was actually really handy for seeing how they differ from one another. I found that my colors were bright and visible and kind of popped off the page in a way that was really pleasing on this paper. This one really surprised me in a positive way. So even as a paper that is still in their lower premium tier, I found that it worked really, really well. And this is definitely a paper that I'll probably buy myself in the future. I like this folding feature. The whole sheet is 9 by 12 inches and it folds down to almost 5 by 7. I think it's 5 by like 6.5. If we look at the three paintings that we've done together side by side up to this point, you can really see the difference in quality. Like the second one looked really nice compared to the first one, and when you look at the first three together, I think that the third paper, that premium folding, is the clear winner of the three. Moving on to the expert paper, I was so excited to show this one to you guys because the painting that I did with it that you saw in the beginning of the video was so enjoyable to paint. This one reminded me so much of some of my favorite hot press watercolor papers. It was just really enjoyable to paint on. I was a little bit concerned in the very beginning because I found that my layers weren't moving very much. Like the color was kind of being absorbed into the paper very quickly and then was difficult to manipulate once I had put it down. I think a lot of the reason that I struggled so much with this one was because I had just come from working with that easy to use and easy to manipulate cold press paper from the previous eye, so I wasn't really prepared for a change in process or workflow, which this paper does require a bit. If you're familiar with hot press watercolor papers and that's something you enjoy, I think that you would really like this paper. Even though it's not 100% cotton, I enjoyed using it so much. I felt that the colors melt together just a bit in a way that I actually really like. It's not so much that the layers and the colors get muddy, it's just that they blend together in a way that is very reminiscent of hot press paper in my opinion, and just gives a really cohesive, soft feeling to the painting overall. I was worried at first that I wouldn't like this painting while I was working on it because it just felt so different to work on than the previous one, but once I allowed myself to shift in mindset from cold press to something more of how I think about hot press papers, I enjoyed it just like I did the very first time I used it. When we look at all of these paintings again side by side, you can really see the difference in texture and how each layer lays differently on that very last paper. It's softer and a little bit more blended than the previous cold press paper, which has more texture to it. And on this newest paper, it almost gives the appearance that the paints are soaking into the paper a little bit more, as opposed to sitting on top of the page like with the folding paper. Alright, so the last one here is the Expert 100% cotton paper. This is the Arteza paper that I've probably used for the longest and have the most experience with. Like I said before, this one is like a classic cold press paper. The texture is a little bit scratchy and almost feels a little bit dry, very reminiscent of other popular cold press papers, and it functions beautifully. The paints stay wet on the page and are able to be manipulated easily while they are wet. There's nice spreading while the paint still remains easy to control and manipulate, and it feels so much like this paper just gives you time to make decisions. I was able to lay in loose, messy brush strokes, take a look at them, maybe even lay in some more loose, messy brush strokes before I even had to worry about blending out those edges or manipulating the wet paint. I didn't have to worry about it soaking in or drying too quickly. It was actually really nice. There is a little bit of a drying shift here, which is pretty common for cold press papers. The colors do dry a little bit more dull, and one feature that I noticed is unique to this paper in particular is that as the paint dries, it's almost as though if the paint doesn't get into all of the little nooks and crannies of the cold press, air comes up between the paint and forms little bubbles, like little pockets of white space in between your paint, as though the area wasn't fully saturated and little bits of air are rising up from those pockets, and it can definitely affect the texture or appearance of how the paint lays on the page once it's dry. There's a lot of this cracking texture, and you're going to have to decide for yourself whether that's a good or a bad thing. I can definitely see it being a really interesting effect in some instances, but if you don't want it, it can be difficult to avoid and might make the experience less enjoyable for you. Overall, I was very pleasantly surprised by the last 3 papers, the folding paper, the expert, and the cotton paper. I'm really grateful to have gotten to try all of these papers. I think that the second paper in, that premium paper, is awesome for swatching and practice and color mixing experiments. I actually have a couple handmade sketchbooks that I have made using that premium paper, and any of the upper 3 papers I would use for finished paintings. They're very different. I like that folding feature a lot. I think it works really well. The sketchbook paper itself, I can't really recommend the sketchbook. I think that especially if you're a beginner, it would be very discouraging to work on. I don't think that it helps you in learning to control watercolors or even learning how to layer or mix colors, as the paper kind of inhibits all of those things and makes it not super useful. If you want to check out any of the products listed in this video, you can find links down in the description. I hope this video has been helpful for you guys and has provided some insight to these different types of paper. Let me know which of these papers you have tried down in the comments below, which one is your favorite or which one you think might be your favorite. And as always, my most sincere thanks to my patrons on Patreon and my members here on YouTube. We're now offering postcards over on Patreon. I cannot wait to get July's postcards and sticker sheets all sent out, and lots of fun rewards on both of those platforms, which you can check out if you're interested. Thank you guys so much for joining me for this really fun video, and I hope you have enjoyed it, and I will see you all next week. Bye bye!